Thank you, everyone. Thank you, everyone, for joining this really important moment in history. And it's a very solemn day, August 6th, the first and hopefully only ever use of nuclear weapons done by the United States. And unfortunately, this was done on Hiroshima and Nagasaki 78 years ago.
Hi, everybody. It's Robert F. Kennedy Jr. here, and I want to thank all of the organizers at Humanity for Peace for putting this conference together and for giving me the opportunity to address you. My uncle, John F. Kennedy, once told one of his two closest friends, Ben Bradley, who was the editor of the Washington Post, when Bradley asked him, "What do you want on your gravestone as your epitaph?" My uncle told him he kept the peace. And when Bradley questioned him on that further and pressed him, my Uncle Jack said that the primary job of a president of the United States is to keep the country out of war. And he succeeded in doing that during his 3 years in office. He never sent a soldier abroad to die. He kept the country out of Laos. He kept us out of Cuba on 2 occasions. He kept us out of Berlin in 1961, and he kept us out of Vietnam. He sent only 16,000 military advisors there, mainly Green Berets. And on October 22nd, they didn't have permission to fight, although some of them did. And in October of 1962, he learned that one of his Green Berets had died, and he asked his aide to give him a combat casualty list. And the aide came back and said 75 had died so far. He said, "That's too many." And that afternoon, he signed National Security Order 260, ordering all 16,000 troops home at the end of November. And of course, a month after that, right at the end of November, he was killed, and a week later, President Johnson remanded that order. Within a year, Johnson had sent the 250,000 troops that the military had wanted from the beginning. But my uncle understood one thing about war, and it's something we need to understand today. My uncle understood that if you want to keep the country out of war, you have to be able to put yourself into the shoes of your adversary. When he came into office, the intelligence agencies and the people around him knew almost nothing about Nikita Khrushchev. President Eisenhower had said that it wouldn't be a soldier, a president who had started out as a soldier who would put Americans into World War III, because the soldiers knew about it. He was a soldier himself. My uncle had been a soldier, was the only president to win the Purple Heart. And Khrushchev, of course, was a soldier and had been in the most brutal battle of World War II in Stalingrad. But the CIA work as spies for the United States were immediately detected. So the CIA knew almost nothing about Khrushchev, and they assumed that everybody in the Kremlin was a monolith. And my uncle felt disabled by that lack of knowledge. And in 1961, he started out his relationship with Khrushchev on a rocky road. They met in Vienna, and he found Khrushchev. He said that we were going to win that war because we had more missiles than the Russians, which we do not have today. They have 1,000 more than us, Russians, and that would be victory. And my uncle left that meeting saying, "And we call ourselves the human race." He knew that he had to. In 1961, in August, there was a confrontation in the Berlin Wall where U.S. tanks were facing down Russian tanks at Checkpoint Charlie. And the world was this close to nuclear war at that point. And my uncle made a back. Khrushchev sent a note back to my uncle Cable saying, "My back is to the wall. I have no place to retreat." And my uncle realized at that point that Khrushchev was in the same position that he was. He was also surrounded by military warlords who were egging for a fight with the United States. And they realized that only the two of them were going to prevent that full-blown nuclear exchange. My uncle made a promise to him that if he withdrew, that if Khrushchev withdrew his tank battalion, and they realized they had to communicate directly with each other. They began a series of 26 letters that they exchanged with each other, highly personal letters that were smuggled by a Soviet GRU spy named Georgy Bolshakov that run their own State Department, their diplomatic corps, their military and intelligence apparatus. So they were talking directly to each other. They also installed hotlines at Cape Cod, where I live, and those wires are still protruding out of the home of the summer lighthouse, which my brother now owns, and another hotline at the White House, where they could pick up the phone and talk directly to each other. And that's more important today than it ever was. Today, we're in a very analogous situation where we are putting Vladimir leadership for many, many months, almost engage Ukraine in peace negotiations. And we have rebuffed those. In April of 2022, the Russians, and we now know the Russians and the Ukrainians, initial peace agreement that was based upon the Minsk Accords, and the Russians were already beginning to withdraw their troops. And yet the U.S. White House sent Boris Johnson over there to torpedo that directly with Vladimir Putin and all sides. And we need to settle this insanity before we initiate another nuclear exchange that would destroy all of humanity. So I want to thank you for all the work that you're doing. And I want to congratulate you and send you all my gratitude for making this a priority for all of humanity. Thank you very much.
You've just been watching a recording that was made by Robert Kennedy Jr., presidential candidate of the United States, which endorsed the rally that was done by the International Peace Coalition and by Humanity for Peace last Sunday, August 6th. This was part of a set of international actions that were taken that day, and which are still being taken, actually, and there's a lot of echoes and reverberations coming from it. Now that the International Peace Coalition, which is an organization pulled together 10 weeks ago by Helga Sepp-LaRouche, has conducted its successful international mass intervention, the transatlantic sector is now actually positively poised to respond to what will be transpiring at the upcoming meeting, August 22nd. It begins in Johannesburg of the BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, which is something that goes way beyond those 5 nations. There are many other nations that are now members of the BRICS. And in fact, if one takes the 54 nations of Africa, scores of which are expected to attend this summit conference, what you're looking at is the emergence of a kind of challenge to an old colonial order hidden for many years in many cases that predominated particularly in the continent of Africa, but it was actually all over the world, in favor of a new just international economic order, at least a discussion about establishing such a thing, to finally end the pernicious legacy of colonialism, whether that's come up in the form of IMF, International Monetary Fund conditionalities over the years, structural adjustment programs, various forms of manipulation of debt in order to manipulate the power of nations. That whole order, that whole process, that whole practice is pretty much at an end. Now, the question is, how will the United States and Europe choose to respond? And clearly, the unipolar world idea that emerged during 1990, May of 1990 to be exact, the idea of project democracy, which was a much somewhat earlier enterprise, which is what is being invoked also in the case of attempting to interest various people in intervening once again into Africa. That these things are obsolete. These whole approaches, their postures, no military adventure, no matter actually how well financed, can in fact restore the mantle of heaven that's been lost by the transatlantic sector. There's no longer an aura of righteousness, as much as these people believe or attempt to believe that they can project that. It doesn't exist. They can't project an aura of righteousness or an aura of power. There are people, they can project an aura of force. And certainly they have the possibility and capability of making coups and assassinating people and things like that. But one has to understand that when Victoria Nuland shows up in Niger after having overthrown in 2014 in February the duly elected and democratically elected president of Ukraine, and then says to people in Niger, which she basically has never visited and doesn't really care anything about, that they have to honor democracy by reinstalling the democratically elected president of Congo, the very fact that she comes with that kind of pretext, they have no understanding of how they're seen. There's a term that the Ugandans used to use for this, and also the Kenyans, back in the 1950s and 1960s, once told to me by former president of Uganda, Godfrey Binaisa. He said, this form of what the Europeans do is referred to privately by African heads of state and others as white mischief. They never talk about this publicly in the face of the people when they come to see them, but they just refer to this as white mischief. It's time for a serious proposal of a new security and development architecture of the type that's been designed by Helga Zepp-LaRouche to come to the fore. And just a few days ago, in the aftermath of the action taken by the International Peace Coalition, Helga Zepp-LaRouche made some remarks about how she thought that this new world, or at least the prospect of what was about to be discussed in Johannesburg, South Africa, might be thought about from an international and a global strategic context.
We are in a truly historic, changing world. You know, I have said we are experiencing a change like you only see it once in 1,000 years. And what I mean by that is that the epoch which started with colonialism around 1500 and which lasted now, 600 years, is definitely coming to an end, and we are now on the verge of a new era of mankind, which either will lead to the nuclear annihilation in the Third World War if the present war danger is escalating, or if that can be avoided, I think we will see a period of cooperation among nations on an equal footing, where not one nation will be dominant, but that you will have a partnership of sovereign nations working to the common good of all. Now, some people may think this is utopian, but that is actually what is underway. And I think that the summit, which will take place from the 22nd to the 24th of this month in Johannesburg in South Africa, will be an event leading to tectonic changes in the world situation. These are the words of the South African ambassador to the BRICS, who announced such a change to come, and that's also obvious to anybody who has watched these developments in the recent period. The foreign minister of South Africa, Mrs. Pandor, said that 23 nations of the Global South have applied formally to be part of the BRICS, and about 20 or so more have informally announced their interest to do so in the future. 67 leaders of the Global South of Africa, that is, have been invited to attend the summit. So this will be a quite incredibly important event. President Xi Jinping of China not only will attend in person, but he then will have a state visit in South Africa following the summit. So I think, and it is my absolute hope, and that's what our whole effort in organizing has been, is that the Western countries should not see this as a threat, which unfortunately most of them have done so far. It's not a threat, it's an opportunity. It's an opportunity to cooperate and establish finally, the end of colonialism, to establish a relationship among nations, where, people start to treat each other as equals. And I think that is a genie which cannot be put back in the bottle, because, the countries of the Global South, in the tradition of the non-aligned movement of Nehru, of Sukarno, of Tito, Nasser, all these people who were founders of the non-aligned movement, I mean, they are now, in a certain sense, grown up, because they have gone through incredible battles, because when they attempted to establish a new world economic order in the 60s, in the 50s, in the 60s, by, coups, destabilizations. But now the world is changing, because, you have now the economic growth right now is not taking place any longer in the G7. They are clearly falling behind. The economic growth is happening among the most important, most developed countries in the Global South. Naturally, China is in the lead, and very exciting. The news now comes from the Great Bay Area in China, that is the region of Shenzhen, Guangdong, Shanghai, Hong Kong, Macau. This region, which I think has 80 million people altogether, and it's the locomotive of the world economy. So if you just take that region of 80 million people, they would be number 12 in terms of economies, just this region, And they announced that they will have now a maglev system with a maglev train going 650 kilometers per hour. Now that's really fantastic, and that will be on a half-hour tact. In other words, these cities will be connected every half hour by such a train, and this is so breathtaking. And if you think about the incredible bridge between Hong Kong and Shanghai, and Hong Kong and Shenzhen, I was on that bridge a couple of years ago before it was quite finished. And it's a fantastic piece of engineering, which they did. I think 120 engineers and introduced patents, Chinese engineers. And, rather for the West to be, on the high horse and say, look, this is a systemic threat, you should enjoy to cooperate. I mean, it's so unbelievably, the economic engine is clearly China, it's clearly the Asian countries, and Germany, which is right now, unfortunately, crashing against the wall because of a evil government, I can only say that what the present economic minister is doing is not just the height of incompetence, but it's outright evil, because it's destroying the livelihood of generations of work, rebuilding Germany after the Second World War. This guy is just ruining it all, and he should be driven out of office at the earliest possible occasion. But rather than looking at these developments as a threat, the West should cooperate. I mean, with the present development, Germany, which is still the number 6 in terms of the GDP output, they will soon be falling behind. Germany used to be number 4, now it's number 6. And right now, Brazil and Indonesia are quickly developing, and they will bypass Germany in a very short period of time. And rather than regarding all of that as a threat, China has offered many, many times the Belt and Road Initiative is open to everybody. They have even made a special model for cooperation, for great power relationship, especially for the cooperation between China and the United States. And, China is putting a great hope that Europe would find itself interest in cooperate with China. And then naturally the joint ventures in Africa and in other Asian countries in Latin America would be the way to go. So, I think in that sense, we are at a total crossroad. Naturally, the war danger is looming, because, as it becomes clearer that the war in Ukraine cannot be won conventionally, at least not, not for sure, not the NATO side will not win, because all these weapons and more weapons and more weapons are leading to the slaughter of the Ukrainian people. I mean, they are being destroyed, and the casualty numbers which are coming are absolutely horrendous. So that is why, our peace demonstration this past Sunday in front of the United Nations was so absolutely crucial. I'm very happy about it. And, Anastasia, you did a tremendous job together with Irene, being the moderators of it, but it was a very broad alliance of people. And this is the alternative. We should mobilize not only to stop the war, but to get the whole world to cooperate with the new emerging economic order, and then we can solve all problems. So I want to stop here, because I'm sure that there are.
All right, so you've now heard what the proper orientation would be of nations that actually wanted to pursue a policy not only of peace, but of development. Certainly, if one remembers what President Ramaphosa of South Africa posed to President Macron in Paris some weeks ago, which he talked about the Inga Dam project, in which he was talking about the need to provide electricity for some 600 million people in Africa that don't have it. And you notice the wall of silence that has greeted that proposal. And that's a very important thing, because that proposal for a hydroelectric dam would seem to be, quote, clean energy. It would seem to certainly not violate the issues of carbon footprint increases and all the things that NATO and others claim to be so worried about. But that's not the intent of the former or present colonial powers of Africa, nor is what's going on there new in any way. And what we're looking at, which is emerging there, in one sense could be made analogous to what happened in 1894, when it can be argued, as Lyndon LaRouche often did, that the First World War, the Great War as it was called, actually started in Africa, in Fashoda, in Sudan, in a conflict between the British and the French, and effectively erupted some 20 years later on the battlefields of Europe. That is something we're seeing sort of inverted in this case. But this is as much part, the thing that is being discussed around the matter of Niger is as much a part of the geostrategic obsessions of the dying transatlantic order, as is Ukraine. What we'll do here is not try to give an analysis of the Niger situation, but to make people aware of a few things, just in terms of this nation, which was last heard about by Americans, if they were listening 20 years ago, back in 2003, or actually a little bit earlier than that, in the case of slightly earlier, because President George W. Bush gave an address to Congress, famous 16 words, in which he talked about how yellow cake found in that Saddam Hussein had extracted yellow cake from the nation of Niger, according to British intelligence, and that this was the basis for believing that Saddam Hussein was working on a nuclear weapon. Ambassador Joe Wilson demonstrated that that was not the case. He wasn't very much beloved by the State Department for doing that. And Niger basically disappeared from any form of American public knowledge or interest. So we're going to put a map up, first of all, to show you the nation of Niger, just to have an idea of what we're talking about here. This nation is approximately 2 times the size of Texas. You can see its central location there, with Algeria on the northwest, Libya on the northeast, Mali on the west, Nigeria, a large border with Nigeria on the south, importantly, and also the nation of Benin. It's about 25 million people in that country. In other words, about the size of the population of Texas. Again, half its size, rather twice the size of Texas, I should say. So actually, it's not an overpopulated area. It's not one of these areas well, it does have teeming Black poor, but not because it should. It has it because, despite the fact that it has, it's one of the 5 countries in the world that have the most uranium. It also, 85% of its people don't have electricity. So not much has been done to care for that population. What we want to do is to say a little bit here, just to give it a context of the actual battle that's going on, not only around Niger, but around Africa. And it has to do with the issue of nuclear power, nuclear technologies, and advanced power access by the people of Africa. So we're going to put something up here as a, take a look at this. It's an article from Nikkei Asia. Russia and China throw weight behind Africa's nuclear power drive. This was written in July of 2022. And what it does is it discusses a bit of this matter. So it says, African countries turning to nuclear power as electricity demand soars are finding partners in Russia and China, offering them an avenue to expand their influence in this fast-growing region. It talks about how Egypt had broken ground on the country's first nuclear power plant. It talked about how it was slated to enter full operation by 2030, 4 pressurized water reactors with a total generating capacity of 4,800 megawatts. And that Egypt and Russia had signed a deal to build the facility back in 2015. Moscow had lent to Cairo $25 billion for the project. But then what the article did was it reported the following. It said, the United Nations forecasts that Africa's population will surge roughly 70% to 2.5 billion in 2050. Okay, so now basically we're talking about 27 years from now, 1 generation from now. And its energy needs are expected to grow accordingly. An International Energy Agency report estimated that Africa's energy demand will grow 75% over the decade to 2030, meaning over the next 7 years, and noted that 600 million people still lack access to electricity. And that was what President Ramaphosa was referring to. Then it discussed that Russia in particular, also China, but it was a little bit different in this, had reached cooperation agreements with Ethiopia, Zambia, Nigeria, and other African nations to train people as engineers. And this was particularly Rosatom. The country is, quote, the company is helping to train nuclear engineers on the continent and has pledged to establish technology education centers in Zambia and Rwanda. Then finally, the China General Nuclear Power Group agreed in 2015 to work with Kenya on building a nuclear power plant, and China National Nuclear Corporation signed a framework agreement with Sudan the following year. This means in 2016. So this idea of the spread of nuclear power has been at the very center of what we are talking about when we speak about Africa as a continent and Niger in particular. There was a video, well, actually a documentary made approximately 10 years ago, a little bit more, by Bob Cohen, who was a researcher who worked at the United Nations. It was called Shadow War in the Sahara, and it covered the conflicts that were going on in that area of the world, and it had a particular discussion about French colonialism. I'm going to play a couple of minutes from that just to give you an orientation of what the broader underlying matters are that actually characterize this African affair.
Extended over much of Western and Northern Africa. It provided the raw materials like the oil from Algeria necessary for the industrial and military rise of post-war France. On September 13, 1960, France detonated its first atomic bomb in Regan, in the Algerian Sahara.
Le fil rouge, c'est le pétrole et l'uranium. L'uranium, c'est l'uranium du Niger. Et quand on parle d'uranium, c'est pas simplement l'uranium, on pense toujours aux centrales d'Areva maintenant, mais l'uranium, c'était pendant très longtemps surtout de l'uranium militaire pour la force de dissuasion nucléaire française. Donc on voit bien que c'est intéressant de voir que finalement le Sahara, c'est quand même toujours le minerai le plus stratégique de la puissance nucléaire, et quand la France, si elle a eu son fauteuil et son poste au Conseil de sécurité des Nations Unies, c'est non seulement parce que c'est une puissance nucléaire, mais aussi pour ses intérêts en Afrique, et les deux sont liés, c'est-à-dire l'Afrique, le nucléaire, et c'est ce qui donne à la France finalement son rôle de puissance moyenne.
But the winds of freedom were blowing across Africa, and France was to lose all its colonies. The independence of Algeria was particularly painful, in part because of its strategic oil reserves. After 8 years of bloody fighting, the French were forced to withdraw.
Il ne faut pas oublier que quand la France s'est fait virer de l'Algérie, c'est vrai qu'il fallait trouver, pour la France, pour De Gaulle, il fallait trouver du pétrole ailleurs, et il a trouvé ce pétrole en Afrique subsaharienne, en particulier dans les pays comme le Gabon, le Congo.
But the
So that gives you just a little bit of a background to understand France's relationship to the area. The United States' relationship to the area is a little bit of a different matter. And that's been the subject of various exposés. For example, The Intercept did an article back in 2020 in which, having gotten hold of various secret documents, they exposed that although the United States claims to have 2 or 3 military bases in Africa, they actually have 29. That since particularly 9/11, you've had a military policy of the United States. There's things that could be said about the 1990s, but we're going to leave that out. The Somalia operation, the famous Black Hawk Down operation, yes, that's all true. But just from the standpoint of the contemporary scene, just looking at these last several years, the United States' involvement has worked together with that of France, and also, not ever to be overlooked, Great Britain. The most famous case of that, of course, was the assassination of Gaddafi, a process that evolved over a period between 9/11, when the United States, in the immediate aftermath of 9/11, engaged Gaddafi in certain negotiations that caused Gaddafi to give up his weapons of mass destruction. In fact, it was touted at the time by the Bush administration as being a kind of spin-off effect of their invasion. That is to say, that when it was shown that there were no weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, the Bush administration said, well, that's true. And yes, we messed that up. But you can see by what Gaddafi did in giving up his weapons of mass destruction that we did the right thing. That's what they tried to do, a bait and switch in which they claimed that. Only problem for Gaddafi was that he mistakenly brought particularly Tony Blair and Nathan Rothschild into what was called the Libya Investment Authority. The Libyan Investment Authority was a $100 billion plus sovereign wealth fund, primarily funded through gold and I think also oil revenue. And the Rothschild and Tony Blair post 2007 became actual co-partners, if you want to call it that, with Gaddafi in that fund. That was the thank you that he got for what he did was his execution carried out through the Obama administration and Sarkozy of France and the various and sundry of perfidious Albion Britain on October 20th of 2011. At that point, with his execution, Lyndon LaRouche at the time said, this is the beginning of global war. So as we said before, referencing Fashoda of 1894, one could actually look at what happened with Gaddafi. And the significance of Gaddafi for Africa was not only the fact that his regime had successfully built the famous underground rivers project, the greatest project, largest project of its type in the world. Not only that he was trying to develop a sort of satellite network, independent satellite and communications network, but he had played an essential role together with other African nations in preventing the United States from establishing what was called Africa, the Africa Command or AFRICOM. They wanted to establish that in Africa, but because of the opposition, this is back in 2007, 2008, they had created it, but they could never get it established in Africa as a result of the opposition largely led by Gaddafi. And so they created it in Stuttgart, Germany. So what is happening here, what we're watching, what's actually evolving, what the American people are seeing is something that has nothing to do with the way it looks. What this is that this is a long-term process that began approximately 2014 in the immediate aftermath of the announcement of the Belt and Road Initiative by Xi Jinping. Specifically, the French began something which is called Operation Barkhane. Barkhane or Barkhane refers to a crescent-shaped sand dune. And they started it in August of 2014. They carried it out through 2022. And what this was recognized that the Belt and Road Initiative proposed a series of trade and development deals throughout the globe, but specifically in Africa. And what was being done was to create a military or quasi-military capability in lieu of having AFRICOM there. And it was pioneered by the French, who used their or tried to use their former colonies, Burkina Faso, Chad, Mali, Mauritania, and Niger, to form a kind of quasi-NATO, which was actually intended to prevent Russian and Chinese influence in the area on development, not on military matters, on economic development. So the key and the thing that is beginning to emerge, we're beginning to see, is the truth of the NATO policies. The truth of the NATO policies is that they are Malthusian. They have nothing to do with freedom, democracy, or any such thing. They have to do with the idea of keeping the world down, particularly the black and brown worlds of Africa and Asia. Because China, the China that had gone through the 100 years, the century of humiliation, the China that was simultaneously occupied by 8 powers, including the United States, the China that had successfully gone through the hemorrhaging of the processes from 1949 until 1976 with the death of Mao, and then had under various leaders shifted to become one of the largest economy ultimately in the world. That China, combined with Russia, have the technological resources to be able to allow for the African continent which is where humanity is shifting to in terms of the birth rates and in terms of the actual vistas of economic progress, the frontier of economic progress. It's recognized by those two nations, Russia and China, that besides the Pacific Basin as such, this other area of the world is about to shift to become the center of world economy. And so what has happened is that the old colonialists, the Joseph Borrells and others that talk about the so-called Garden of Europe, these people have decided, using the pretext of whatever they can pick up, whether that be climate change or that be authoritarian regimes or that be some other whatever, they basically, lack of payment of debt or something, they basically are trying to find their way back to power, a power that they can no longer and can probably never regain. And of course, the issue for them is, can they use the thermonuclear threat? Not the Russians threatening, they're threatening. Can they use that to somehow subjugate these nations? We don't believe that they can, but we wanted to set this up as a context for our guest of today to have some to both respond to that and give us a bit of his observations. Dr. Clifford Kiracofe has been with us several times. He's been involved, of course, in some of the organizing around the issue of the International Peace Coalition. He runs an organization devoted to this himself in Washington, and we're happy to have him with us today. So, Cliff, the floor is yours.
Hey, Dennis, it's great to be here with you today, and hello to all of our viewers. You covered a huge waterfront there, almost an ocean of ideas and concepts and observations. I think because you concluded on Africa, let's start there. Let's put it into some historical context briefly. We can go back to the late 1400s, that's about 500 years ago, when the Portuguese were the first to sail down that western coastline of Africa and then discover that slavery might be a profitable business for the Portuguese Empire for the purposes of sugar plantations in the New World and all of that, the Atlantic slave trade. So the white European imperial powers, Portugal was an empire by then, formed policies to exploit Africa. First, of course, it was the slavery, so they were exploiting human beings. And then later, it turns into minerals and the modern industrial economy of the 19th century, needing minerals and to fabricate objects, industrial objects. So by the late 19th century, so we're about, 400 years or so after the Portuguese started this process of exploitation, colonialism, through colonialism as an instrument of exploitation. We have these, what was called in the late 1880s, called the Scramble for Africa, which meant that the various European imperial powers focused on various geographic areas of Africa to exploit. So they kind of divvied Africa up. And you had the French in West Africa, you had the British in Egypt and Sudan and all of that down in South Africa, the Dutch and the British, the Belgians in the Belgian Congo, etc. So this is 1880s, this is quite some time ago, when you had the scramble for Africa by the European imperial powers. The United States was not involved. The only country we had an involvement with there was Liberia. And the only country that did not get exploited, other country that did not get exploited was Ethiopia, which remained independent of colonial powers. So this sets up then the industrialization processes in Europe through the exploitation of the resources of Africa, mineral resources. And bear that in mind. Let's keep the concept of mineral resources in the back of our minds. So then after World War I, the European imperial powers continued in Africa, exploiting their colonies in various ways, mining, agriculture, and so on. Now we come to World War II. President Roosevelt had an American ethos, an American vision that not only would the United States help to conquer the Nazis and the Japanese militarists, but the United States would also play a role in the post-war world of decolonization, which is to say he was opposed to the continuation of European imperialism and colonialism after World War II. The idea was, okay, we've had this world war, now we want to have a peaceful globe, and part of that is going to be the elimination of European imperialism, which is to say French imperialism and Belgian, British, and all of that. And thus, you would have a decolonization process that the United States would support. So that was President Franklin Roosevelt's vision, which Americans, the average Americans felt was a morally justified and a good thing for Americans to hope for and to work toward. We were colonies ourselves for 150 years. So the Chinese talk about their time of troubles, etc., for 150 years, but I mean, we were colonies from 1607 to 1776. So do the math. Then what happened as the Cold War set in, Franklin Roosevelt's vision for decolonization and end of imperialism, while ultimately it was realized in the 50s and 60s, still there was resistance by the colonial powers. Vietnam is one example, the French in Vietnam. So that's a quick overview of the problem of imperialism and colonialism. Now, what Dennis is referring to when he went back to the 1980s, 1990s, even 1960s, is we start to see a neo-colonialism, a new colonialism in the face of independence movements, liberation movements on the African continent, North Africa, Algeria, of course, and then other parts of sub-Saharan Africa. So the neo-colonialism by the Europeans continued then in the 50s and 60s. And when countries, for example, the French West African colonies that Dennis mentioned, when they became independent, the French already had in place since 1946 an economic scheme to link all of the West African colonies that they had and link them to a monetary system. So France would print the currency for all of those countries. And those countries, when they became independent, those countries would have to deposit half of their bank reserves, national reserves in France. So what France did was move from a more military occupation type of colonialism to a financial type or economic type colonialism. And in Niger, and so in recent years, Mali, Burkina Faso, and now Niger have rejected living under this French neo-colonialism and have rejected being exploited for their minerals, as Dennis mentioned, uranium, for example, in Niger. And similar mineral issues in Mali and Burkina Faso. It's interesting that in the recent conference in Moscow, the Soviet African, Russian African conference, that the many leaders of Africa attended in person and otherwise sent top officials to that conference. I believe over 40 countries were represented at that conference. And there was an interesting photo of the leader of Burkina Faso dressed in military style, shaking hands on a podium with President Putin. Quite an interesting image there was there. And so what about Niger? Well, the current, you could say, revolutionary regime or government has displaced the former corrupt government, and they now want to reorient Niger toward a development and self-help and development. They will also orient toward Russia and China for help, technical help, economic help, social, medical, whatever. So this is the sort of process we see happening in Niger, which also is happening in other countries around Africa. As Dennis pointed out, this is a period now in the world where we are moving from a post-World War II system, a Western-dominated system, Western being Europe and the United States, etc., Canada, a Western-dominated system now toward a multipolar system, meaning that other centers of economic growth and development and so on are emerging around the world. There has been this process in Asia since the 1950s and 60s, with Japan and then the smaller countries, little tigers and all that, rising up, Thailand and Malaysia, etc., Singapore. So those, and they were former colonies also. So that part of the world has come up quite nicely as a center, and ASEAN, ASEAN, Association of Southeast Asian Nations, kind of encapsulates that part of Asia as rising. Some people talk about China as a rising power. Well, I've been to China a number of times, over a dozen times, and I've taught in China. I was visiting a colleague in Shanghai who was dean of a School of International Studies at Tongji University. And we were talking, and I mentioned something about the rise of China, and my friend Xi Jinping said, "Well, it's really the rise of Asia, Cliff. It's not just the rise of China; it's the rise of Asia." And so when Dennis was referring to Africa, that kind of went through my memory, my mind, that yeah, we're going to be seeing the rise of Africa. But the only way Africa can rise is through throwing off the chains of the neo-colonial chains that have been imposed on them. That's why the Niger, Mali, and Burkina Faso are of particular interest right now. And we definitely are in a situation of global change. And we'll probably see the next decade, 10 or 20 years, I think is going to be fairly turbulent until the world readjusts to a new balance, a new international system, a new international situation. So that's about what I would have to say so far on Niger. Dennis, we can go into it further, but I just wanted to give the big historical picture before we would get into details about the present situation in Niger or in Africa.
Yeah, well, thank you for that, Cliff. I think this is the way to proceed is exactly to take what you just said, and now I want to do something a little bit different, which we're going to go back. We're going to go to the rally, to a presentation that was done by Scott Ritter there. Scott Ritter, the former UN weapons inspector in Iraq, who 20 years ago, stood against the invasion of Iraq because he knew that there were no weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. And he knew that before there was a war, and he said it before there was a war, even as George Bush and others were telling us about Saddam Hussein's yellow cake from Niger, which was in fact a fairy tale, or essentially a fairy tale. And so what we're going to do is we're going to show Scott's presentation. I think that's followed by a brief presentation that Helga also made to that rally. I want to get your thoughts about both what Scott is saying and about the implications of what he's saying. Let's go to that now.
I feel like Eddie Vedder up here or something. Everybody can hear me okay? First of all, I want to thank everybody for coming out today. It's a beautiful day. I want to thank the organizers. This is a wonderful cause. And hopefully we'll be able to take what happens here today and build a community that can bring about the change that we're all looking for. In Chris Nolan's movie, Oppenheimer, there's a very important scene. It's about the man who made the atomic bomb, J. Robert Oppenheimer. He oversaw the team, the Manhattan Project, that built the bomb. And there's a scene in the movie after the bomb has been perfected and tested, the Trinity device, where Oppenheimer is watching two men in uniform packing up the gadget to send away. And he starts to opine on how it could be best used. He says, you know, if you ignite the bomb at it, give it out, and they cut him off. They say, it's okay, Dr. Oppenheimer, we got it now. We got it. And thus we transferred the world's most deadly weapon away from the scientists who made it into the men who would use it. And they did use it. 78 years ago today, the United States of America dropped one of Oppenheimer's gadgets on the city of Hiroshima. We don't know how many people died. Ranges from 77,000 to 125,000. We don't know. 3 days later, over the city of Nagasaki, we dropped a second gadget. The total casualties go between 130,000 to 250,000 people dead because of these bombs, but we don't know because most of the evidence vaporized. They don't exist. They're gone. The world's most deadly weapons. The men who dropped these bombs, Paul Tibbets and Charles Sweeney, were men of honor. They're men who were serving their country. Paul Tibbets flew combat missions over Germany in an effort to defeat the Nazi threat. So I don't want to hear anybody say how evil he is. He was doing his duty as an executioner does their duty. He never once voiced any regret for his decision to drop the bomb. To his dying day, he said, what I did was right. You know, and I have some sympathy for Paul Sweeney because when I was in the Marine Corps, I was in a field artillery unit that was nuclear capable. And twice a year, we practiced the procedures we would follow if we were called upon to deliver a nuclear device against a hostile enemy force. And I will tell you right now, with absolute certainty, I and every single Marine would have obeyed those orders had they been issued, because we were the executioners. We weren't the ones who came up with the device. We were the ones who were going to use the device in defense of our nation. But then something happened. In the 1980s, rational thinking seemed to grip the United States. There was an amazing event that took place in June of 1982, right down the road here in New York City. 1 million Americans like yourself gathered there and demonstrated against nuclear war, demonstrated for arms control. At that time, the President of the United States was Ronald Reagan, hardcore conservative. He called the Soviet Union the evil empire. A year after this demonstration, ABC put out a TV series called The Day After. Ronald Reagan watched this series. And after seeing the depiction of what life after a general nuclear exchange between the United States and Soviet Union looked like, he turned to his advisors and he said, is this what it's going to be like? And they said, no, Mr. President, it's going to be far worse. It's going to be worse than you can possibly imagine. And that set off a light bulb in Ronnie Reagan's head. And in December of 1987, he signed the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty with his Soviet counterpart, Mikhail Gorbachev, and began the process of getting rid of J. Robert Oppenheimer's device. It was the first time that the United States and the Soviet Union didn't speak of limiting the growth of nuclear weapons, but actually eliminating these weapons from the face of the earth. And you know who participated in that? You know who led the charge? Who's on the front lines in making this treaty possible? People like me, executioners, formerly trained to use nuclear weapons, and we are now having our skill sets corralled into getting rid of nuclear weapons. And ladies and gentlemen, that was a good thing. Unfortunately, we were not able to maintain the momentum. We got knocked off track. Arms control today is not happening. The last remaining arms control treaty, New START, expires in 2026, and there is no negotiation taking place today to renew it. And this is happening at a time when both the United States and Russia are talking about spending billions of dollars, some would even say trillions of dollars, in modernizing their nuclear forces. But this time the modernization will take place without any limitations, without any restrictions imposed by arms control. It will literally be a nuclear arms race. Now, what makes this more dangerous in the 1980s? In the 1980s, we operated with a doctrine called mutually assured destruction. It meant you use your nukes, we use ours, we all die, therefore, let's not use the nukes. Now, that's a pretty stupid way to live life, but it's better than thinking that you can win a nuclear war. Today, the executioners of Americans' nuclear policy believe a nuclear war can be won. We have a doctrine that says that we can preemptively use nuclear weapons anytime we want to. It's not just me saying this, ladies and gentlemen. We'll take the words out of the mouth of a Trump-era arms control official speaking to the Arms Control Association when he said it is the goal of the Trump administration that every morning Chinese and Russian leaders wake up, they don't know if this is the day we're going to nuke them or not. That's an honest-to-God quote. That's insanity. And yet that's America's policy. Now you'll say, wait a minute, Scott, that's Trump. What about Biden? Biden has the exact same policy of nuclear preemption, a policy that's being implemented without any restraint from arms control. And now we bring in the issue of Ukraine. We have a war going on in Ukraine that's not a war between Russia and Ukraine. It's a war between Russia and the collective West, including the United States. The goals of the United States in this conflict are simple: the strategic defeat of Russia. Now, Russia has said that a world without Russia is a world no one will live in, which means if you try to strategically defeat Russia, they will use their nuclear weapons to protect themselves. Yet the goal and objective of the United States in providing more than $180 billion of U.S. taxpayer funding to Ukraine is to enable Ukraine to strategically defeat Russia. That means that our policy is to commit suicide. Ladies and gentlemen, that is literally the definition of insanity. That is crazy. Now, today in the United States, there's men and women who wear the uniforms of the armed services of the United States who are sworn to protect our nation. Some of these men and women have the job of using nuclear weapons if and when called upon. These are people like Paul Tibbets who will execute that mission. But you know, the people in the world today that have the ability to employ nuclear weapons don't just speak English. They speak Russian. They speak Chinese. They speak North Korean. They speak French. They speak Indian. They speak Urdu. Hindu, I guess. I should be accurate. Apologize out there. I'm a Marine. Sometimes I say things that I shouldn't. But the bottom line is we no longer have a nuclear monopoly. If nuclear weapons are used, this is a global problem. But we are the only nation in the world that has a doctrine of preemption. We are the only nation in the world actively pursuing a policy supporting Ukraine with the goal of the strategic defeat of Russia that will result in general thermonuclear war. We are the only nation willingly trying on a daily basis, not just to have Russia wake up and China wake up, questioning whether or not this is the day we will use nuclear weapons. Every person in the world wakes up wondering if this is the day. Now let's go back to the movie about Oppenheimer. That scene. J. Robert Oppenheimer turns to the men in uniform and tries to tell them about the nuclear device. They say, "We got it here, boss. We got it here." Okay, but now we know. We can't claim that we don't know. No one in this audience can say, "I don't know about the threat." Nobody in the world today can say, "I don't know about the threat." And it's time that we have that meeting again with the executioners, with the men and women who will execute nuclear policy. And this time we turn to them, and when they try to say, "We got it here," we say, "No, we got it here. It's over. The day of nuclear terrorism is done. We must learn to recapture the spirit of disarmament that gripped Ronald Reagan, and there's no one out there right now that's more conservative than Ronald Reagan, that gripped him in his heart to make him believe that having nuclear weapons was insanity and the best course of action for the United States and the world was nuclear disarmament. We need to recapture that spirit, and I'm hoping that today we can begin a process that leads to a moment next summer when we can put 1 million people back into Central Park and send a signal to those who wish to represent us in the White House that nuclear disarmament is the only direction for the United States, that the day of the executioner is over. Thank you very much.
To all the courageous people demonstrating today for peace. We have to wake up people all over the world. Never before was mankind in a bigger danger to annihilate itself in a global nuclear war. Of the more than 12,000 existing nuclear weapons, which are today up to 1,000 times more destructive than the bombs of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, 3,800 are immediately deployable and about 2,000 are launched on warning. If it comes to nuclear war, as there are politicians today who are recklessly taking into account the use of these weapons, not even a historian will be left to investigate how it could come to this incomprehensible catastrophe. If it happens, the people who die in the first minutes will be the comparably lucky ones, for in the following days, months, and years, all life on this planet will become extinct, both through total radiation and a nuclear winter of many years. Everything what have thousands of generations struggled for, all sorrows and joys, all poems and songs will vanish forever. We demand the immediate controlled destruction of all nuclear weapons. But even more profoundly, we demand the realization of a new global security and development architecture, which takes into account the security interests of all nations of this world, big ones and small ones. This architecture must overcome the geopolitical bloc formation once and for all, and put the interest of the one humanity first. The precondition for this is a new just world economic order, which allows every nation and every human being to fully develop all of their innate potentials. Let us unite the peace movements all over the world with the nations of the global south for the realization of a new paradigm in the history of the human species. The new name for peace must be development.
Now, Cliff, you've been the president of the Washington Institute for Peace and Development, I think the founder of it as well. You've served in the Congress as well. And of course, you just heard what was said. We had a question that came in while that was playing, which I'd like you to take up in the context of whatever remarks you have and thoughts of what has just been said. The question is, how can formal treaties between nations ever be taken seriously in the future, judging by the way Trump tore up the nuclear treaty with Iran, and later Germany and France turned their back on the Minsk Accords protecting Russian nationals residing in Ukraine. Now that's the question that's formed, but I'd like you to sort of put it in the context, because obviously Scott talked about some very specific things about disarmament negotiations. You've seen these things from the standpoint of being a congressional staffer for many years. But then again, Helga, in her statement, after identifying the character of the danger, makes this matter of a new development architecture, again, comes back to it. So I realize it's a lot of different things, and you can therefore choose how you want to approach it, but I think that would be useful to take us in another direction here.
Okay, delighted to, Dennis. And those are powerful comments by Scott and also by Helga. I'll just go kind of chronologically through Scott's key points. He mentioned Oppenheimer, and that would be the Manhattan Project, and that led to the development of the atomic bomb. Franklin Roosevelt himself, historians say, was not personally inclined to actually use it. He had it being developed because Nazi Germany had a program, et cetera, so it was thought that we better have a program too. He didn't tell Truman about the program as vice president. He didn't particularly trust Truman. FDR died early, well, not early, but he died tragically too early. And Truman rose from vice president to president. Now, why did Truman drop the bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki? By the way, Nagasaki was a traditional Christian city. Why did he drop the bomb? Who persuaded him to do such a horrible deed? Truman was very enthusiastic about dropping the bomb, kind of gleeful, actually, that we had such a weapon. The main influences on Truman, the key influence was Winston Churchill. Secondary influence was Jimmy Burns, a racist politician from South Carolina who became Secretary of State. So Truman was profoundly influenced by Churchill. And the reasoning was, well, we'll drop these bombs on Japan to send a message to the Soviet Union to sort of watch out, guys, we can do this to you if you don't get in line with the West after World War II. So here we have the murder of several 100,000 innocent Japanese civilians to send a message to Russia, to Soviet Union. That was the logic. That was what went down. Our military was opposed to the use of those weapons. All of the generals, Ike Eisenhower, Admiral Leahy, all the key generals were against using that weapon against Japan for two reasons. One, it wasn't necessary because Japan had lost the war, basically. And two, it was immoral. Nonetheless, Truman proceeded under Churchill's pressure and Jimmy Burns's support to order those weapons dropped. So I wanted to get that part of the story out. And I want us to compare what Scott was telling us about how the military was thinking about using the weapons these days, knowing full well their destructive capability, in a preemptive strike. Now, notice that that's 180 degrees opposite what our patriotic military figures in World War II felt about the use of atomic weapons. So, you know, we can think about how do we account for this 180-degree turn in the military and in thinking in Washington from the atomic bombs against Japan. The second part of point I wanted to make was on Iraq and the yellow cake issue. Now, I served on the United States Senate staff for 11 years. 5 of those years, I was senior staff, professional staff member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. In that official capacity, I did travel to Iraq in 1990, just a few months before the war against Kuwait was launched by Saddam. And Joe Wilson wasn't at the embassy when I was there, but I was briefed by the country team at the embassy about the situation in Iraq. And I visited everything, well, Baghdad, of course. I visited northward all the way to Erbil and southward all the way to Basra and the Fao Peninsula. So I saw a pretty good chunk of Iraq at that time, prior to the war. I can say that in my briefings, just a couple of months before Saddam attacked Kuwait, that it was hard to gather intelligence on the Iraq target. It was very tightly controlled by Saddam and his secret police. So it was very difficult for our embassy or the British or the French or whoever was there to collect and report significant information about the regime and its intentions. As a matter of fact, I would like to say that the Saddam attacked Kuwait in August 2nd of 1990, and I got a letter from my friend Joe Wilson, who was mentioned by Dennis, in July, although it was delivered after the attack. And Joe wrote me saying that he, hello and all that, and that he and his wife were headed for some R&R in the south of France. So I said, well, eat your heart out, And so this is in July. So Joe's writing me a letter about he and his wife, he was ambassador, taking a vacation in the south of France for a few weeks. And then a couple of weeks later, we have the unexpected invasion of Kuwait. I just thought I'd put that in for the historical record. It's quite interesting. Of course, Joe went to Niamey, to Niger, and Joe spoke French, so it's easy to go to Niger and speak French. And concluded, of course, that there was no diversion of uranium yellow cake. That was kind of put together as a lie by the neocons who had penetrated the administration. And they particularly penetrated like they did under Reagan, particularly penetrate the DOD. So the yellow cake was a total lie. And another lie associated with that was the so-called aluminum tubes for missiles. And complete lie that Michael Ledeen and some of the others invented. And but we said, oh my goodness, there's aluminum tubes and they're going to be used for, rockets and this and that. It was just another lie. So that's Iraq. The lesson there is that administrations will lie about the situation so as to have a pretext to go to war. So we need to think about that. And we can think about that on the Ukraine situation, but that's a totally another topic. The final point that I think Scott mentioned that's very important for us, it's critical, is this idea of getting back to wanting and demanding arms control. We need to not only begin that process of limiting arms, but we need to, or at least freezing them, and then bring down the level of weapons that various sides have. So arms control is a key concept. In terms of a new architecture that Helga mentioned, international security architecture, international architecture, and development concepts, etc., peace through development. let's not forget that the League of Nations back after World War I and the United Nations back after World War II, that was the role that people, idealistically, but somewhat practically too, but that was the role that people hoped for, that the League of Nations and the United Nations following it could contribute to this very, very process of global economic development and diplomacy. The whole concept here is diplomacy, arranging, making arrangements between countries to satisfy their needs, respecting their equal positions. But this idea of diplomacy, the United States has gotten completely militarized. Everything, the militarization of foreign policy. Our foreign policy today is basically run by the Pentagon. And in a sense, it's militarized. And so the State Department is kind of an auxiliary branch of the Pentagon. Where is American diplomacy? Where are our diplomats? Back in the day of Franklin Roosevelt and all, we had very famous diplomats in different parts of the world. Through the 50s and 60s, we had famous solid American diplomats, George Kennan and Chip Boland and D.K.E. Bruce. And there was a whole raft of very talented diplomats trying to navigate the Cold War, which wasn't so easy, but we didn't blow the world up. So diplomacy then is needed to start to create this new architecture that Helga talked about. The UN, unfortunately, has become dominated by the United States and Western countries, and so the UN Security
We having a problem with his audio? Okay, we seem to have lost Cliff here. Well, what we'll do while he's off, or maybe he'll be back, and I'll let him summarize his point when we get him back. But let's go while we are waiting to a second video clip, which tells us a little bit more about the Africa situation. And we play this actually to imply some of the area of intelligence and research that some of you may wish to help us do in order to make more clearer to the American people some of the deeper connections into the Niger situation. So let's just go to that video.
Of Africa, with plans to stay. They established their first military base in Djibouti at Camp Le Monnier, a former French Foreign Legion fort. Rudolf Atala directed counter-terrorism efforts in Africa for the U.S. Department of Defense.
The Sahel played a key role in looking at the movement of weapons, the movement of potential foreign fighters, organized crime. During that time period, you also had an influx of cocaine flowing in through the Sahel. So all of this was of primary interest, and it continued to grow.
The Pentagon produced a series of maps in 2002 marking off this whole part of Africa as a terrorist corridor of terrorism. And of course, the official narrative from the Pentagon and the White Department is that these terrorists had come from Afghanistan. They'd been driven out by American forces, which we now know they weren't, but the narrative at the time was they've crossed through Bin Laden country, i.e. Sudan. They're linking up with terrorists in North Africa. They've come through this sort of belt, this banana-shaped area.
Jeremy Keenan, a British professor and author, has spent 40 years studying the Sahara. He argues that the military engagement of the United States in the region was about more than just security.
There had been in America probably something much more important at the time than 9/11. That was the publication of a thing that's known generally as the Cheney Report. And the Cheney Report, I think, was the first executive order that President Bush gave when he came into power, which was to look at the crisis of the energy sector in the States. In 1997, imports of energy, oil, had surpassed the 50% level. And that was psychologically sort of crisis level. In that report, it focused on future American supplies of oil, and of course it focused on Africa as becoming the most important supplier of good quality oil that would fit the American internal infrastructural system, even more important than the Gulf. So suddenly Africa becomes of critical importance to, if you like, the political classes in Washington.
Now, Cliff was off there for a minute, and I just give him a little context for that, and I'll make a quick comment. I show that not in order to merely bring up, as I said, that's an interesting little point to research concerning Cheney in this report. I would not, especially given that we have British intelligence giving us this, which also gave us the yellow cake story. I would not assume that the quote Cheney report played the role that it said that it plays there. But I will put it this way. Dick Cheney, during the period of the first Bush administration, Bush 41, when he was Secretary of Defense, shaped the policy, which became what was called the unipolar world policy, the project for a new American century, particularly put it forward, but it was under Cheney that a Team A and Team B were formed to describe this, to discuss this. And in May of 1990, on the 20th of May, a committee called the 520 Committee met. One portion of that committee was headed by Paul Wolfowitz and Louis Libby. The other part of the committee, Team B, was headed by Colin Powell. And Team A represented and also recommended the policy that became known later as the unipolar world policy. Team B's policy was not accepted. And this was presented by Cheney to then President Bush, George Bush 41. This was during the year before Desert Storm would begin, although they were already beginning to assemble the forces for Desert Storm. Then subsequently, when Cheney became de facto president in the G.W. Bush administration, Bush 43, this policy, which is identified there, was written up. And let's remember that Cheney was also in charge of the terrorism research that managed to miss 9/11, despite the fact that people like Gary Hart were trying continually to meet with Cheney in the administration, including as late as September 10th, when Condoleezza Rice told Gary Hart at that time she would get in touch with the vice president and tell him about Gary Hart's concerns that he believed that an action would be taken in the United States, perhaps involving planes, perhaps involving tall buildings and other such things that were said at the time. Be that as it may, the important element here is not to look at the American side of it, but the British American side of it, particularly people like Lynn Cheney and Baroness Liz Simmons and their, shall we say, somewhat incestuous relationship in procurement of weapons and military hardware, and to recognize that we're looking at something which is not motivated by what people call the profit motive, but it's more motivated by the kind of thing that the still with us Henry Kissinger once described to Mao Zedong, that power is the ultimate aphrodisiac. While there is a certain, so shall we say, profit motive, there are other motives involved, deeper pathological motives that I think only someone who understands and investigates the British mentality could really understand in the form of Americans that go along with it. So I just wanted to put that in as you were not here, to keep people entertained and to keep them thinking. So please pick up your point as you were making it.
Okay, Dennis, thank you. I'll come back to that oil and Africa thing in a second, but I just wanted to, when I was trying to wrap up my remarks, we had a computer issue here. I'm in the countryside, so sometimes the connection isn't perfect. Arms control, we need to get back to it. I think Scott Ritter is absolutely correct. That's what we need to focus on. We need to demand a diplomatic process for arms control to be started up again. And you freeze things and then you lower the amount of nuclear weapons and ultimately you get rid of them. But we need to freeze and then go lower. In terms of the new architecture that Helga mentioned, I wanted to make a comment that that's going to require reform of the United Nations, which has fallen under the control of the white people of North America and Europe. If you look at the votes in the General Assembly, it's usually about 140 votes of the everybody else versus about 50 votes of US, Europe, and a few allies here and there, Japan and South Korea. So what the Russians call the global majority is what's moving the world along now. The global minority is fading in its appeal, its interest, et cetera, et cetera. But my point is on, we need to revitalize the UN, make that the center of peace and diplomacy through peace through diplomacy. On the oil situation that the gentleman you had the film clip on, I remember very well, we even had hearings in the Senate. I remember very well the oil geopolitics of oil that the Washington was playing with in terms of Africa. And it was West Africa, sound familiar? And it was the coast, the Guinea coast, and along the coastline there in West Africa, where there's awful lot of oil off the coast and on land too, but off the coast. And so that the strategic idea was, well, gee whiz, if there's a problem in the Middle East, the Persian Gulf gets cut off, heck, we can just get oil right from West Africa and just go right across the water to the United States. Real simple, just across the Atlantic. So that oil issue that he mentioned is a very real issue in terms of geopolitics, and it does impact, of course, West Africa and the waters off of West Africa. Not to mention, of course, a little further down in Angola, which is an oil producer, et cetera, et cetera. So there is that oil factor. Of course, the oil factor in Algeria, et cetera, all that, Libya. And on the Libya point, I wanted to make, Sarkozy was leading that. The United States was backing up Sarkozy and getting rid of Gaddafi. But I wanted to make a point that in Libya, my brother had visited Libya. He's an architectural historian, and he was photographing some of the Roman ruins there. So he spent some time in Libya under Gaddafi. He said it was, a very advanced, very excellent country in terms of people were happy, people being educated, et cetera, et cetera. However, when the Chinese had a very large presence in helping Libya develop, and so there's a very large Chinese presence in development projects, oil and others in Libya. And I think that's what Sarkozy and NATO was targeting. They wanted the Chinese to be scared out and pushed out of Libya so that they didn't have a partnership with Gaddafi and Libya as a driving force in African economic development and political development too. So that's my old comment. On your comment on Cheney, Cheney was driven by the neocons. We knew that way back in the 90s and all, but that's a whole story. But it's fundamental to realize that Cheney was a creature of the neoconservatives. This is not only Leo Strauss, the philosopher, but neoconservatives like Irving Kristol and all the neoconservatives that penetrated the Reagan administration in the Pentagon. And we're talking about Richard Pearl and all these different people. And so, as Dennis, as you said, yeah, Cheney was the acting president, where Bush was kind of just the guy out front there, and it was really Cheney who was calling the shots. I do want to point out that one of Cheney's advisors at that time, way back, was Victoria Nuland. She worked for Cheney. I just want to remind people of that. Now she's trying to make a war with Niger, actually, and she's already got the war, her war with Ukraine. So I want to just emphasize the idea that Cheney and the neocons. When we get back to the British point, that well, one other point on Cheney, he went to Halliburton, an oil servicing company, a very rich company. He went to Halliburton after he left Washington. So you can see the oil connection with Cheney and Halliburton. In terms of the British connection in West Africa, there were French colonies in West Africa that we've mentioned. There were also British colonies in West Africa. Most famous one, of course, is Nigeria. Also Sierra Leone, for example. So there were also British colonies in West Africa on the coast. And Nigeria, when I was a student, universities, and we were all supporting Biafra. And that was the Igbo people of Nigeria kind of revolting against the dominant tribal groupings, ethnic groupings there, because they were being held down, and they were the ones that had proximity to oil in the water. And so the Igbo people didn't benefit from the oil wealth of Nigeria. So there was a revolt, the famous revolt, the Biafra revolt. And many years later, I met the leader of the revolt, my friend General Ojukwu, who died a few years ago. But I had many interesting conversations with General Ojukwu about oil and politics in West Africa. On the attempt by France and the United States to get a grouping, which is called ECOWAS, 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 to get that grouping of West African countries to intervene in Nigeria. Okay, that was a scheme a few weeks ago. Let's get ECOWAS to intervene in Niger. That was immediately denounced by Mali, by Burkina Faso, by Chad even, by Algeria, denouncing this Western idea to use the ECOWAS countries, led by Nigeria, for example, to invade Niger to put down this new government. There's a complicating factor in Nigeria, because in northern Nigeria, that is the ethnic domain of the Hausa people, Hausa. That's a domain of the Hausa people, and they overlap with southern Niger. So inside Nigeria, the West can't just push a button and have Nigeria invade Niger, because an awful lot of Nigerians are friendly with Niger, and they don't want to. Why should they invade? It's a neighbor, you know. So that's a very interesting new twist in the last, several days, the last week of that developing situation there. I don't know, Dennis, what else? I mean, we can talk about some other points, or we can go deeper into some points.
We are basically coming up to the end, Cliff, but I'd like you to respond to something which I know is not known to people in the United States in general. It's available to be known, but like many things that should be focused on, these things don't come to the attention of people. And I'd like this to sort of be, we're sort of converging on the end. So take this and see what you can do with it. We have a photograph that Jose will put up, and then we'll describe what this is. Just want to make sure that you can see it and everyone else can see it.
Okay, I'll be looking for it.
Okay.
Oh,
there, yeah. Now this is a photograph of an event that took place on November 5th, 1946, at the Officers Club of the Army War College in Washington, D.C. And in part, we're showing this to you, Cliff, because we're hoping you can explain the mentality of the Washington Beltway to us a bit. The occasion was to mark the disbanding of what was called Joint Army-Navy Task Force Number 1. Now, these are the people that did all of the post-World War II atomic tests in the Pacific. But this is, we're talking between basically, September of 45 and October, November of 46. Okay, so they did the test at Bikini Atoll and those places. So this got published on November 7th. Washington Post had it there as the center of their society column. And it was called Salute to Bikini. So a a Unitarian minister named Arthur Powell Davies. We couldn't get a picture of him, but he saw this, and here's what he had to say. I have with me here in the pulpit this morning a page from a newspaper. It contains a picture, an utterly loathsome picture. If I spoke as I feel, I would call it obscene. I do not blame the newspaper for printing the picture or the photographer for taking it. What fills me with bitterness is the fact that such an event could take place at all. It says it is a picture of two high naval officers and a very beautiful lady. They are in the act of cutting what is called an atom bomb cake. And it indeed is a cake shaped in the form of an atomic explosion. I do not know how to tell you what I feel about that picture. I only hope to God it is not printed in Russia. To confirm everything the Soviet government is telling the Russian people about how American degenerates are able to treat with levity the most cruel, pitiless, revolting instrument of death ever invented by man. The naval officers concerned should apologize to the armed service of which they are a part and to the American people. No apology would be sufficient to efface what it may mean to the people of the world. Now, so what happened was this caused the controversy that many people defended the photograph and many people wanted to defend the American military because the bomb had to be dropped and so forth and so on. But then what happened was Arthur Davies, the minister, got a letter from Dr. Howard Bell, from whom I also could not get a picture. Howard Bell was an official in General Douglas MacArthur's provisional government in Japan. So he wrote to Davies and he basically denounced Davies for not using stronger language. Said he understood, quote, you, quote, had to make some concessions to the proprieties of pulpit utterance. So he excused him on that basis. And then he described him the hardship of the Japanese school children, particularly in Hiroshima. And he suggested, this is Dr. Bell was suggesting to Reverend Davies, that American school kids could clean out their desks and send spare school supplies to these kids in Hiroshima who didn't have anything. So Reverend Davies decided it was a good idea. So about in February of 47, this means about 3 months later, he delivered a sermon called In Reply to a Letter from Japan. And he basically asked the young people in his congregation to comply. And so that's what they did. So they collected paper, crayon, erasers, and so on. Now, what happened was the children that got those materials responded, and particularly at one school, which was called the Hankawa Elementary School, or Hankawa Elementary School in Hiroshima. They decided that they would use the paper and the crayons to do watercolors and paintings. And the themes were Our Friends of America and Peace in Japan. So these became called the Hiroshima drawings, went on a worldwide national tour. And there's something like 50 drawings and paintings. For a long period of time, they sort of got lost, but were refound again in the year 2007. So I'd like you to, and what they point out in the story that's told about this is that something that started out as being what appeared to be a moral atrocity created the conditions for a lasting expression of peace. That's the way that the story tells it. What's your view of this? And what do you think this says in all aspects?
Okay, let me quickly go back to the question that was asked to me about treaties. And my answer is the Minsk that was mentioned, the Minsk Treaty was a false process. The French and the Germans pretended to want to get to a treaty, pretended to want to have some kind of a process that would reorganize Ukraine fairly. But, and that was revealed that it was a fake diplomatic process. So when it comes to treaties and such, they should be kept, of course, but also we have to be aware of these fake diplomatic processes. In terms of the Japan-US relations, don't forget that the United States and Japan had good relations in the 19th century, late 19th century, all the way up to about World War I. And in the late 1880s, 1890s, you know, there were Japanese exhibit at the Chicago World's Fair. I think 1893, I think that was quite a hit. It was spectacular. So the cultural relations and diplomatic and political relations between the US and Japan were just fine, we can say, up to about the First World War. And then the Japanese militarists in the military and political circles in Japan became dominant in Japanese politics and policy. And so the pro-American or pro-peace, pro-diplomacy, and several Japanese politicians that were pro-peace and pro-diplomacy were actually assassinated in the 1930s by the extremists. So when we get to, so we did have decent cultural relations and on both sides. However, that disappeared, of course, in the 1920s and 30s, and then as Japanese militarism, and ended up with dropping it is poignant that the children that you mentioned, that there was that attempt and action to try to heal some wounds. And I think the minister's sermon is quite powerful and quite appropriate. And I think it reflected how many Americans felt back in that day. Today, we've had so much propaganda out of Washington and through our major media that Americans may be tricked into having some support for anti-Russian and anti-Chinese policies, to include military action. And we're already at the brink of war with Russia right now in Ukraine. I mean, we're at a it's imperative that we reflect on the Oppenheimer, Manhattan Project, et cetera, that has really across the country now with that movie, 3-hour movie. We reflect on that and regain some of the moral concerns that many people had, including our top military brass back in that day. However, you showed the picture of some Navy guys with the cake, and that the Cold War set in immediately after 1945. The first Cold War situation was Iran, and it is said, I don't know if it's true or not, but it is said that Truman threatened Russia with a nuclear weapon if Russia didn't pull out of northwestern Azerbaijan in Iran. So if that story is true, then we did threaten Russia with a nuclear attack in 46, that would have been. So by 47, you had the Cold War developing, and certainly 49, you had NATO created. And then you had the nuclear testing and all that you had mentioned. So it's very interesting to trace how the moral Eisenhower, all the key, and Admiral Leahy was one of the key advisors to Franklin Roosevelt. And so the two naval officers in that photograph are completely opposite the moral concerns of Admiral Leahy. So my comment would be on that the Cold War unfortunately altered people's perceptions and facilitated the militarization of American society beginning in 1950 with the NSC 68 that Paul Nitze put together that militarized US foreign policy. Of course, then we had the Korean War, of course, and then that triggered even more desire for nuclear stuff. And then we had the so-called missile gap in the 1960s, which was a fake. So coming back to the poignant children trying to reach out to each other for peace, I think that's exactly what Helga is talking about in her comments today, that we need to find a way toward peace, and we need to put ourselves in the other person's shoes, other countries' shoes, and how do they feel? And we can't just simply dictate to the planet anymore, the United States or NATO Europe. The world has changed. And as I mentioned, the US and NATO Europe are in the minority of people on this planet. And the people on this planet now, there's a shift. And whether it's been since 2013 when the Belt and Road Initiative was announced, or more recently, the Ukraine war, whatever, but there is a shift. There's a power shift. There's a power transition. And Asia, Russia, Asia, Eurasia, Africa, the global South are gaining in not only economic power, but military power, but also culturally. We have to understand that civilizations like China, India, and all have cultural values that are specific to them, but then also are universal. Sort of like how the young children could kind of have a universal humanity at their level between school children on either side. So that would be my thought.
Well, Cliff, I will just say this to you. I think that if Americans like yourself and Ray McGovern and Scott Ritter and others are able to be as vocal as we have been and are joined by others, I think that that would be the basis for the world to see that there's an America that can ally with the rest of the world, independent of the sort of misanthropic expressions that we see, which are the product often of propaganda, and also are the product of certain kinds of backwardness, which can be overcome by any group of people. So I want to thank you, Professor Cliff Kiracofe, for being with us today, president of the Washington Institute for Peace and Development. And we're going to end today by showing the presentation made at the Sunday rally by Diane Sayre, independent candidate for United States Senate from New York.
Thank you, Anastasia and Irene. Thank you, everyone, for coming out today. If there is not a major change in the United States, there is reason to believe that this day, August 6th, would be a good time for us to say our goodbyes. Our goodbyes to each other, goodbye to the planet, and goodbye to the paintings of Rembrandt, the discoveries of Ibn Sina and Albert Einstein, the philosophy of Confucius and Leibniz, the principles of the US Constitution, the poetry of Shelley, and the music of Beethoven. We are steadfastly marching toward the thermonuclear annihilation of everything created by man. Wasn't that the point of dropping the bomb on this day 78 years ago? It wasn't about making the Japanese surrender. That was already under negotiation. The purpose of dropping not one, but 2 bombs on civilian population centers in Japan was to demonstrate that we could do it and that we were willing to do it. Is there anyone here so naive as to believe that we have become more moral since the day that Madeleine Albright declared that although it was a tough decision, the lives of 500,000 Iraqi children was a reasonable price to pay to achieve our goals in Iraq, which apparently we still haven't achieved because we're still there, illegally occupying that nation. You know, the American illegals squatting in nations all over the planet who don't want us there. So it's time for you to disabuse your friends of the notion that some wise person who has somehow managed to stay out of jail inside the Beltway is going to stand up and stop this thing before we go over the cliff. Waiting for that person would guarantee that we were all finished. But having said that, I am not pessimistic. I'm optimistic because I don't intend to allow the annihilation of the human race to occur while I have breath to fight. I know we are here today because we agree that we cannot let this happen. And although they are not here with us in Dag Hammarskjöld Plaza, billions of people around the world are saying no to Anglophile, which sounds a little bit like pedophile, hegemony. The leaders of African nations are banding together with Russia, China, Brazil, and others, and they are saying, no, you cannot make us send weapons to Ukraine for your proxy war with Russia. No, you are not going to tell us whom we may elect as the president to lead our people. As soon as these international leaders can hear and see signs of sentient life from within the United States, we will have a global resistance which can liberate us all from the billionaire perverts who seek to divide, rule, and depopulate us. In 1988, Lyndon LaRouche made a bold proposal for the reunification of Germany based on what he knew to be the coming end of the Soviet communist system. They were bankrupt, and he said, let us feed Poland in return for the reunification of Germany. 3 months later, he was sitting in federal prison. But the Soviet Union did collapse, and Germany was reunified. But instead of embracing this as a great opportunity to liberate mankind and raise the standard of living worldwide, Maggie Thatcher, the iron-pumping Prime Minister of the UK at the time, and George H.W. Bush jumped on their flying carpets and broomsticks and flew all over the world, starting wars. We had the hideous invasion of Panama, the first Iraq war, war in the Balkans, the Malvinas, and many, many more wars that we don't even know about. LaRouche from prison and his wife Helga from Germany warned the arrogant Anglophiles who believed they were the winners that just as the communist system collapsed, the collapse of the British liberal free trade system was nigh. And when that system collapsed, there would be a great revolutionary change of far greater magnitude than the dissolution of the Soviet Union. That moment has arrived. As Jamie Dimon of JP Morgan Chase gobbles up one bankrupt bank after the next, subsidized by taxpayer-funded bailouts, I am sure that there are plenty of Wall Street and City of London insiders
wallowing in their dirty diapers in secret board meetings trying to figure out what to do. I don't know what to do. Let's overthrow Putin. Let's overthrow Xi Jinping. Then it won't matter if we collapse because at least they won't be running the show anymore. Well, it ain't working. The beautiful irony is that the more that they try to destroy other nations, the faster they destroy themselves. I think that's how God intended for things to work. So we're on the brink of thermonuclear war because that is all they have left to do. I and others here are running for office because that we know we have to shift the United States. But I think November of 2024 may be too late. We need Americans in the streets now. We need delegations in 435 congressional districts, visiting your congressman so many times that you are on a first name basis with every single staffer in their office. Anyone who supports one more nickel going to Ukraine should never be elected for anything ever again. Anyone who votes to impose sanctions on nations to starve their children to death for regime change purposes must never be elected again. And they should know that now. Julian Assange should be released from prison immediately. Lyndon LaRue should be exonerated. NATO should be dissolved. What is needed is an entirely new order among nations based on mutual respect for the sovereignty of their people and the dignity of man. Our enemies are totally morally and financially bankrupt. So we must seize this moment to firmly establish a Republic of the United States of America, which doesn't meddle in other nations' internal affairs, but demonstrates by our own actions within our own borders that truth has standing, that justice will be served, and the people protected, so that through their talents, they may contribute to the betterment of mankind. Thank you.